Stranger of Paradise is one of the strangest games I've ever played. The writing and acting are terrible, it regularly looks more like a PS3 game than a PS5 game, and as a whole, it feels incredibly scattershot, with its characters, environments, enemies, story, and music all feeling like they've been ripped from entirely different games and slapped together ham-fistedly. So on paper, this game sounds like it should be a complete and utter train wreck. But despite all these glaring problems, I still found myself thoroughly enjoying Stranger of Paradise, largely because of its exceptional combat mechanics. Stranger of Paradise served as a stark reminder for me that 9 times out of 10, gameplay is the most important aspect of a game, and it's crazy just how easily you can overlook a game's other issues when the gameplay is great. Stranger of Paradise serves as an alternate universe prequel to the original Final Fantasy, offering an origin story for that game's iconic villain, Garland. This is an interesting premise that deserved much better than the barely lucid story that this game provides. Stranger of Paradise is one of the worst written AAA games in recent memory. The dialogue is atrocious, nearly every performance is awful, the tone of the game swings wildly between melodramatic and just plain absurd, and the game is plagued by blatantly telegraphed plot twists that you'll see coming a mile away. And in the rare moments where Stranger of Paradise tries to hit you with an emotional plot beat, it feels hokey and just falls flat on its face. Stranger of Paradise's protagonist Jack is one of the most unlikable characters I've ever encountered in a game. At his best, he's painfully boring, while at his worst, he's obnoxious and irritating. Every time Jack opened his mouth, I found myself rolling my eyes. I don't remotely blame the actor for how awful this character is though, because the dialogue he was expected to deliver is just ridiculous. In the lead up to release, Jack talking about killing chaos became a meme because of how many times he says that line in the trailers, but somehow the trailers undersold how many times this damn line appears in Stranger of Paradise. Variations like, "When are we going to fight chaos? All I care about is killing chaos, and looks like chaos has been waiting for us," are littered throughout this game. It feels like Jack says some variation of kill chaos every 2 minutes in this game. But talking about killing chaos a million times is still better than when he's just grunting in response to people. Jack is far from the only problem though. The entire cast of Stranger of Paradise is bland and uninteresting, and there's not a single character in this game that talks like a real person. The 2 companions who are with Jack from the start, Jed and Ash, feel like such boring, throwaway characters. And I feel like 2 months from now, I won't remember the name of any of the supporting characters from Stranger of Paradise, which is a really sad thing to say about any game, let alone a Final Fantasy game. The Final Fantasy franchise has spawned some of the most memorable characters in all of gaming, so the cast being so forgettable here is beyond disappointing. Stranger of Paradise's writing is so terrible that I legitimately questioned whether it was intentionally bad, and they were aiming for a schlocky B-movie feel and just missing the mark. But I fear that might not be the case. Part of me thinks that someone at Square Enix thought that Stranger of Paradise's clumsy dialogue and edgy characters were legitimately cool. If you want to see how awkward Stranger of Paradise's dialogue is, just look up the scene of Jack meeting up with his party members Ash and Jed for the first time at the start of the game. The characters kind of just grunt at each other before pulling out crystals. Then Jack literally says, "My mission is to kill chaos." The others say that they have the same objective, then the 3 of them fist bump. It's genuinely the weirdest way I've ever seen a cast of characters introduced. And to be fair, the game does later try to contextualise some of the clunky dialogue and weird behaviour of its characters, but it still doesn't really explain why any human beings would ever act like this. The silver lining is that Stranger of Paradise is far less story-driven than a mainline Final Fantasy game, so there's usually only a cutscene at the start and end of each mission, and they're often mercifully short. Eventually, I did let the absurdity of the game wash over me, and I started to somewhat enjoy watching each new cutscene, because they're so bad that they start to become entertaining, providing a similar sense of enjoyment to a movie like The Room. Though I did absolutely hate how the game closes out. It feels like it wraps everything up in the most cliched and sloppy way possible. At times, it literally resorts to using flashbacks consisting of still images with voiceover played over them, and somehow expects this to elicit an emotional response out of you. One thing I was a little surprised by with Stranger of Paradise was how grim and violent it is at times, especially for a Final Fantasy game. In this regard, it gave me major pangs of Final Fantasy Type 0. Take the opening cutscene of Stranger of Paradise for example, which sees Garland cutting down an army of soldiers in a very bloody fashion. This was one of the few cutscenes that I genuinely liked, because it made Garland feel intimidating. It almost reminded me of a more grisly version of Rogue One's Vader hallway scene. Unfortunately, after this point, everything else with Garland ranges from dull to straight up goofy. Fortunately, now that we've gotten the worst aspect of Stranger of Paradise out of the way, we can talk about its greatest strength, its gameplay. The deep and robust combat of Stranger of Paradise is phenomenal, which should come as no surprise, as Team Ninja have proved time and time again that they can provide excellent combat mechanics through games like Ninja Gaiden and Nioh, and thankfully, Stranger of Paradise is a very combat-heavy game. Stranger of Paradise's fights almost feel like what you'd get if you mashed a character action game with a Souls game, taking the deliberate, weighty, and challenging combat of Dark Souls and blending it with the combos and special moves that you'd find in an action game like Ninja Gaiden or Devil May Cry. What makes Stranger of Paradise's combat so exceptional is its clever spin on a Final Fantasy job system. Jobs are basically your character classes, and Stranger of Paradise allows you to switch between jobs on the fly, rather than having your character be locked to just one. This allows you to completely change up your strategy between fights, by equipping a new job class to ensure that you always have the best loadout for any given situation. All up, there are 28 job classes, and while some of them of course play similarly, many of them feel drastically different to play as, which lends Stranger of Paradise's battles a lot more variety than nearly any other action RPG. You can be a swordsman and play it like a more traditional action game, or you could play as a pugilist and beat your foes to a pulp in hand-to-hand combat. Or perhaps you'll encounter a big tank of an enemy who you'll want to decimate with the Marauder's brutal axe attacks. Or maybe you'll be in a situation where there are a lot of enemies that have clear elemental types, where you'll want to play as the mage so you can strike your foes from a distance with spells that exploit their weaknesses. You can even have 2 job classes equipped at any given time and switch between them instantly with the press of a button. You level up each job class individually, and they all have their own full skill tree, and through leveling up the various classes, you'll start unlocking new classes, as well as subclasses known as advanced classes. For example, while you'll get the mage early on, there's actually 3 unlockable subclasses of mage that longtime Final Fantasy fans will no doubt be familiar with those being the white mage, black mage, and red mage. White mages focus on healing and buffing their allies and themselves. Black mages have the highest damage output through their large variety of offensive spells, while red mages are your all-rounders who can do a little bit of everything. Some classes are like a blend of 2 other classes, and to unlock these, you'll need to reach the end of the skill tree for the 2 classes their abilities are derived from. For example, maxing out the White Mage and Knight classes unlocks the Paladin job class, while maxing out the Thief and Monk classes will give you access to the Assassin job class. Each class has its own combos and special attacks, and has specific weapons and gear that they're best suited to utilise. Because of this, Stranger of Paradise has an absurd amount of weapon variety. There's a plethora of different swords, hammers, axes, gloves, daggers, and spears, so everyone's sure to find at least a few weapons that they're comfortable with. During a fight, you can hold circle to put Jack into the Soul Shield stance. While in this stance, he can absorb enemy attacks, which will restore some of his MP and help stagger enemies who hit the Soul Shield. Jack can even store the enemy's attacks that he's absorbed, and then use them himself against another enemy. Each enemy you encounter in Stranger of Paradise has a stagger gauge, and by laying into them with weapon combos and special attacks, you'll whittle their stagger gauge down. Once it's fully depleted, they'll be left open to being killed with a flashy finishing move. Something that keeps the combat interesting in the long run is the amount of enemy variety Stranger of Paradise offers. Even if its strange lineup of human, sci-fi and fantasy enemies also goes to highlight what a bizarre mishmash of ideas this game is. There's goblins, machines, pirates, and just about every other enemy you could conceivably cram into this game. It's such a weird smattering of enemies, and honestly, I kinda don't mind it. I'd rather they got creative and threw everything in here, even if it does feel messy, rather than be stuck fighting the same handful of generic enemies over and over again. Stranger of Paradise has a variety of awesome boss fights that are often very challenging. These fights force you to rely on your other party members far more than you would in a normal battle. You'll always have 2 party members with you, and you can issue some light commands by telling them to use their special attacks on an enemy. In boss fights, you'll need to have your allies draw the attention of bosses away from you, so you're not just getting bombarded by an endless array of attacks. You'll want to jump in, land a few hits on a boss, then back up, let your allies attack the boss, then jump back into the fight yourself to draw the heat off of your teammates so that they don't get downed. Stranger of Paradise has a more linear structure than most Final Fantasy games. It doesn't have an open world or a world made up of interconnected areas. Instead, it's purely level based, with you choosing which level you want to jump into from an overworld map. The actual level design of Stranger of Paradise is another area where you can see the influence Dark Souls had on this game. Levels are filled with shortcuts like ladders, ropes, and elevators that you can activate to make the environment easier to navigate on repeat visits. As you explore these levels, you'll come across checkpoints that let you save, and interacting with one of these will refill your health potions, and you guessed it, cause all the enemies in the area that you've defeated to respawn. There's actually some pretty clever level design in Stranger of Paradise that's best highlighted by the game's environmental puzzles. For example, one of the levels you visit has orbs that change the weather when you interact with them. Making it rain will cause vines to grow, giving you pathways to new areas, while other areas are flooded and you'll need to make it sunny to dry them out before you can explore them. One interesting concept Stranger of Paradise presents, but then seems to immediately forget about, is having the mage's spells affect the environment. Early on, there's a section where your path is blocked by a fire, and you have to use the mage's water spell to douse the flames. So I assumed that there would be a lot of scenarios like this throughout the game, but it turned out to be an underutilized idea that's basically never used again throughout the rest of the game. There's a huge amount of variety to the locations in Stranger of Paradise, with the majority of them feeling like they're directly inspired by locations from prior Final Fantasy games, which makes sense seeing as this game was developed as part of Final Fantasy's 35th anniversary celebrations. The environments keep getting more and more interesting the further you get into Stranger of Paradise, which on one hand kept me always interested to see what was coming next, but on the other hand means that some of Stranger of Paradise's least interesting and weakest looking areas are crammed into the front of the game, so Stranger of Paradise doesn't make as strong of a first impression as it probably should, which I could see driving some people away. Once you've cleared a mission, you'll often be able to return to its location to complete side missions, though certain side missions require you to find an orb hidden within the level to access them. While the side missions see you returning to old locations, you will often encounter enemies that you didn't see on your first time through the level, which does make the locations feel at least a little more fresh. Stranger of Paradise strikes the perfect balance with how many side missions it offers. It has enough side missions to feel like they're adding some extra value to the game, while not throwing so many side quests at you that they become tedious and overwhelming, which I find to be a problem in a lot of games. Once you've finished the story of Stranger of Paradise, you'll get access to a series of new, more challenging side missions that see you going through gauntlets of rooms and boss rushes, and you'll also be able to start scaling the difficulty of each of the missions so that you can keep earning more powerful gear for your party. In the lead up to release, Stranger of Paradise copped a lot of criticism for its subpar visuals, and unfortunately, the final product isn't much of an improvement. Let's not beat about the bush. Stranger of Paradise is a pretty ugly game. There are some awful textures, the stiff facial animations feel at least a couple of generations outdated, and characters' eyes never look like they're looking quite where they're meant to be, which causes many of the characters to land squarely in the uncanny valley. And the whole game has this ugly, grainy look to it. It almost feels like there's some hideous filter over the screen at all times, which makes Stranger of Paradise look like it's constantly running at a much lower resolution than it actually is. It's truly jarring just how much crisper the menus look than the gameplay and cutscenes. I played through the PS5 version of Stranger of Paradise, and I think it might be the worst looking PS5 game I've played. There are times where Stranger of Paradise honestly looks like a PS3 game running at 720p. Stranger of Paradise's character design is also incredibly uneven. There's some awesome looking enemies, especially when it comes to bosses, and I'll always love the design of classic Final Fantasy enemies like cactuars and tonberries, but it is egregious how dumb Jack, Jed and Ash often look. The way they're all dressed in the beginning of the game makes them feel like they don't belong in the fantasy world they exist in. Oddly, while Stranger of Paradise's gameplay always ran silky smooth for me, I did encounter occasional frame rate issues in cutscenes. While these issues weren't present in every cutscene, it certainly wasn't a one-off isolated incident, and they did pop up a fair few times throughout Stranger of Paradise. The visuals, combined with its bizarre writing and poor performances, give Stranger of Paradise a very anachronistic feel. Stranger of Paradise almost feels like a game that was made a decade ago, but somehow never saw the light of day until now. Nothing illustrates the jumbled nature of Stranger of Paradise better than its soundtrack. The music in this game is all over the place. The score features some amazing music that'd feel right at home in a classic Final Fantasy game. Do yourself a favour and look up Jack's theme. It is such an epic feeling piece of music. There's also some genuinely fun rock music throughout the game that's sure to get your blood pumping during a big fight. But then there's other music that feels completely out of place, especially the songs that have an electronic sound to them. And Stranger of Paradise also features the most unusual use of Frank Sinatra's My Way that I've ever seen. While the music doesn't all work, when it hits, it really hits. So I am glad they at least swung for the fences with this soundtrack. Stranger of Paradise is kind of a hard game to review. It's undeniably a bit of a jumbled mess with no consistency to its story, locations, music or visuals, but the gameplay is superb. So the question I keep asking myself is, does Stranger of Paradise's excellent combat mechanics make up for its various shortcomings? Obviously the answer to that question is going to be in the eye of the beholder, but for me, they do. In the end, I really enjoyed my time with Stranger of Paradise because gameplay is what's most important to me. And while it's impossible to overlook Stranger of Paradise's countless shortcomings, its amazing battles do make them an easier pill to swallow. Now that we've reached the end of this review, I just wanted to clarify a couple of things about the channel quickly. In my last video, I said I was working on recap and review videos for Summer Game Fest Kickoff Live and the Xbox and Bethesda Showcase. Obviously these videos never came to fruition. I had some stuff come up that I had to deal with, and by the time I was able to get around to working on videos again, it felt like the moment had passed for those videos. Fortunately for me, I don't think either of those were the most exciting showcases in the world, so there wasn't too much I was clamouring to talk about. So I decided to just push on with the reviews I've been working on, so hopefully things should be back to normal now, and I'll hopefully be able to get the next handful of reviews up without there being as much of a gap as there was between the Wonderlands review and this video. As always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this review, be sure to like, subscribe, or leave a comment. You can find countless other videos on my channel, including my recent reviews of Tiny Tina's Wonderlands and Horizon Forbidden West. And be sure to stay tuned for my upcoming reviews of Ghostwire Tokyo, LEGO Star Wars The Skywalker Saga, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge.